Thanks very much, Keith. And thanks everyone for attending. A pleasure to meet you all. What I can do is I can share my screen and kick straight off into a demo. Demo doesn't take particularly long, so it should only take 10 or 12 minutes. And then we can use the latter part of the call to really answer any questions or hear any feedback about what it is that we do and how we do it. So without any further ado, let me share my screen. Perfect. So everyone should now be able to see my screen. Do let me know if you can't. So we are Define. So we're a young legal tech company currently based out of the UK, although we have clients and users all over the world. So obviously in the UK and Europe and Hong Kong, Singapore, as well as in the Americas. And Define exists to solve for an age-old problem, not only faced by lawyers, but any user of a legal agreement. And that's that I cannot access all that information contained in that contract or agreement I'm reviewing without ever having to leave the clause or provision that I'm currently working on. And so if you look at this clause 27.3 in front of you, everything that I've highlighted in gray represents either a defined term or reference, the meaning of which is contained elsewhere in the agreement. And currently, I probably use a number of ineffective methods to access this information. So I may use a Control F, in which case I'm taken to the first use case of that term in my contract, not necessarily where it is defined. I might simply be scrolling through that agreement to simply find a defined term or reference. If I have multiple monitors, I might open the agreement twice, one on the definition section, once on the clause or provision that I'm trying to review, and sort of be scrolling between those two monitors to make sense of my agreement. Or lastly, and certainly what I used to do as a lawyer, is just have a hard copy printout of the contract next to me and be flipping through that contract side by side with the digital review on my desktop. And at the end of the day, all of these methods are time consuming, they're inefficient, and they impede that accuracy of my review. And actually, as a result of the lockdown and migration to remote working, a lot of these ineffective methods have been taken away from me. So I may not have multiple monitors in my home setup. I also might not have the printing facilities required to be continuously printing off 200, 300-page contracts in my home set. Define solves for this problem by being a Microsoft Word plugin that very quickly scans any agreement or document you're working on and allows you to access all that information you need without ever having to leave the clause or provision currently being reviewed. And before I go into how it actually works, just to note that it was important for us to create Define as a Microsoft Word plugin, because Define is the platform with which lawyers are most familiar. It is where we spend most of our time drafting and reviewing agreements. And so by meeting lawyers where they are, we typically get that widespread adoption and usage within the customers that we currently work. So what I'll do now is show you how you would use Define within a typical legal document. And what you'll note is as soon as I performed a scan using Define, I'm able to not only access those defined terms and references, but to interact with them, to edit them, to even insert definitions into my document, importantly, without me ever having to navigate away from that provision that I'm trying to review. So the first thing I do when I want to use Define is hit that Open Define button, and Define will immediately start scanning any agreement you have in front of you. So this is about a 300-page contract. You'll see the scan takes a matter of seconds, so it's actually already complete. And I'm not locked out of the contract whilst that scan is taking place. As soon as I finish scrolling, you'll notice two things. The first is that I get the snapshot of my agreement on the right-hand side, and I'll touch on what each of these terms mean a little bit later. The second thing that you'll note is that all of those defined terms and references now appear highlighted in green. And so if I want to see what interest period means, for example, instead of having to use one of those ineffective methods I described earlier, all I now have to do is simply double click on interest period, and I can now see the meaning of that term side by side with my review of this clause 14. I can also access any of that nested information. I can see what loan means. I can see what term loan means. I can continue that process in perpetuity. I can equally access any clause reference, such as clause 15, and see the entirety of that clause side by side with this review of clause 14. I can also edit anything in clause 15 by hitting that amend button, and you'll see the split screen will come up. So at the bottom half, there's a definition or reference I want to amend. I always have the context of the clause I'm currently reviewing at the top, and you'll see the Define side panel automatically pulls that information across. And once I'm done, I hit that remove split button, I'm taken back to this clause 14 that I'm working on. And what I can actually go ahead and do now is actually insert a definition for amendment in my contract. So you can see it's a capitalized noun. So I might want to go ahead and actually define it in my agreement. And again, I can do so using define without ever having to navigate away from this clause 14. So I simply highlight that term I want to define, right click and click on define. And you'll see there's the term that I want to define. I can choose that keyword based on what my document uses. So this document uses means, so I'll keep it as is. I can change that font based on the style of the document. And all I have to then do is simply assign that meaning to amendment. I choose where in the document I want to place it. And you'll note that define is actually automatically placed it in the correct alphabetical order. All I then have to do is hit that save definition button. An amendment is now added to my document as a defined term. And you'll see it appears highlighted in green, just like any other defined term. If I double click on it, there it is with the meaning I've assigned it. And if I click on go to, I can actually see it in the document itself. And importantly, by clicking on go back, I'm always taken back to this clause 14 that I'm working on. Define also allows you to work across multiple documents. So oftentimes there might be certain terms which are used in that agreement that I'm currently reviewing, but which actually have their meaning contained in another separate agreement. And what I can do with define is link that separate agreement and see the meaning of that term as it is defined in that agreement, again, without ever navigating away from the provision or document I'm trying to review. And so all I have to do is go to the multiple documents tab in the define side panel. I simply link whatever agreement I want to link. In this case, it's a separate definition schedule. And I can now simply go ahead and double click on any terms such as margin, and I can see how it is actually defined in that linked agreement. Not only that, but I can actually navigate to where it is located in that linked agreement. So I hit that go to button. I'm taken to where margin is defined in that linked agreement, and I can very easily make any edits as I ordinarily would in Microsoft Word. I hit that go back button. I'm taken back to the clause that I'm working on, and you'll actually see that the define side panel automatically pulls that information across. Define also completely integrates with track changes. So oftentimes I might be making markups or edits to a contract, and I'll be doing so with track changes enabled. And so let's say I wanted to make an amendment to alternative reference bank rate. I simply have to double click on that, hit that amend button that I showed you earlier, and I can now go ahead and make any edits that I want to that definition. And this time I'll do it with track changes enabled. Something else to note is that alternative reference bank rate is an inline definition. So define works equally with both inline and listed definitions. I hit that remove split button, and you'll see now when the define side panel updates, it automatically shows me those changes in markup. So importantly, I'm always getting that authentic representation of my contract in the define side panel itself. And then outside of these live reviewing and editing features, we also have a number of useful reports. So the first report is our definition report, and this allows you to see any defined term in your contract. So I can easily see what accounting principle means, for example. Not only that, I can see where it is used in my contract as well as how it's used. So if I click on that clause 26.1, I'm immediately taken to the first use case of the term within the context of that clause. I can also access any undefined terms. So this is any capitalized noun or phrase which has been used but not defined. And I can insert a definition again from where I am in this agreement. And then lastly are those unused terms. So this is any term which has been defined in my agreement, but actually not used in the body of the document. And what I can do is simply delete that from where I am. Currently, I have to do a Control F through all of those defined terms just to make sure that they've actually been used in the agreement itself. And then our second and final report is our reference report. So the reference report operates as an interactive table of contents and allows me to very quickly access any section, clause, annex, article, or indeed schedule my contract. So I can see what clause 13.7 means. If a client calls and wants to discuss schedule 7, again, I can search for and bring up that information without having to frantically scroll through my document or indeed lose the context of my review. So that's a bit about Define in a nutshell. We're a 360-degree one-click solution, and that's because I'm able to access all that information I need without ever having to navigate away from the clause that I'm trying to review. And the big benefit here is that efficiency gain. So we define that not only as that improved time saving, but also the increased accuracy of my review. So because I'm no longer having to scroll through a document or look at a hard copy to see the meaning of a defined term or reference, all I now have to do is double click, we almost completely eliminate that time waste. There's also the improved accuracy component. So I'm no longer relying on presumed knowledge. I'm not guessing what a contract might say or what a defined term might mean. I can have all that information I need to inform the clause I'm currently reviewing side by side with that clause. There's also the talent retention piece. So I think, none of us enjoy dealing with those inefficiencies which are inherent in Microsoft Word. And so by optimizing Microsoft Word for contracts, we allow people to focus on the value-added substantive legal work. Then there's the ease of use components. So as I mentioned earlier, it was important for us to create Define as a Microsoft Word plugin, but also to make the software incredibly intuitive. So we find lawyers are typically up and running after a short 15-minute training. And then lastly, the remote working. So I also touched on this a little bit at the beginning of the demonstration. But as we've moved to a more remote working environment, certain inefficiencies have crept into the way we work. And Define not only optimizes the way you work in the office, but ensures that you can work with that same efficiency and effectiveness, whether you're working either at home or in the office. So that's a little bit about us, what we do, how we do it, and why we do it. Maybe just to sort of finish off discussing some commonly asked questions on some points. So we launched Define. We sort of spent 2 years in the development stage. We launched towards the beginning of last year. Since then, we've been very lucky to get a lot of traction in the market. So we currently have a number of customers, which include the likes of Allen Overy, Dentons, Barclays, Deloitte, Slaughter and May. We're doing a number of other pilots with some big firms, both globally. So Auric as well, Johnson & Johnson, to name a few, as well as a number of middle-sized and other firms across, jurisdictions. So we've been very lucky to get that early traction. Just another point, to make just around Define. So Define is purely a local install. So what that means is we don't extract any sensitive contract information. So nothing that's held on your computer or in your contract is ever seen or stored by us. So typically IT and information security teams really like us because it's a very lightweight, non-intrusive tool in itself. So currently Define only works on English language documents. So to the extent to which you were working in foreign language documents, Define would not work, although it's very much on our roadmap to be launching the ability to work not only in English, but across multiple different languages. The other point is that Define would work on any agreement whatsoever. So we don't say you have to define terms in a certain way or structure your references in a different way. I know a lot of the sort of contract styles that are done in America can be very different to the contract styles that exist within Europe. And so we cater for all of those jurisdictional differences. You wouldn't have to change the way you work or the way you structure those documents itself. And then one final point, which is something that we often get asked, which, I think makes complete sense, is, given law and given the way the legal business model works, which is obviously typically charging on a per hour basis, why would I want to adopt a tool that actually makes me more efficient and potentially could mean that I would charge a client less? And I think, the answer to this in a very high level is really twofold. So I guess, the first one is we don't only work with law firms, so we also work with a lot of in-house legal teams, both at some of the biggest companies in the world, as well as a lot of SME companies. And typically they can see the efficiency gains which Define offers, and they're starting to ask their law firms, what tools do they use to drive efficiency? And actually, when you're trying to bid or get that work, it becomes a big part of actually getting that client on board is the ability to show that you're using tools, any kind of efficiency tool. The second point is obviously Define is not trying to replace the way lawyers work or anything like that. We're not trying to use fancy artificial intelligence to be a lawyer. We really just trying to optimize the way that lawyers work. And so the work that we actually optimize for, automate, is typically the type of work that clients are not going to want to pay for. So, I think we all know about realization rates. So I might work 8 hours in a day, but a client would only pay me for about 6 or 7 hours of that because there is going to be pushback on the invoice that I ultimately send out. And what Define does is really optimizes for the time that the clients aren't going to pay for. So let's say that I work 8 hours in a day and a client's only going to pay me for 7. What Define really does is actually says, well, let's give you that extra hour back that you would have had to spend working and not receive back, and actually allow you to then do substantive work, which you can actually charge to clients. So really it drive home the improvement in realization rates and ultimately profitability for the firms. So what I did is I put through a very simple illustration of how these kind of work in practice. And this is more just to talk to our pricing model, which I'll talk to after this. And a lot of the feedback that we've received from some of the customers I mentioned is that when they're working heavily within agreements, they can save up to 30 minutes a day. And if we just take a very basic charge out rate of $100 an hour, I used to be a lawyer in South Africa, so I know that's probably even reasonable from a South African standpoint. And if you were saving someone 30 minutes a day on work, which they were never going to be able to charge a client for, you essentially give that law firm another $50 a day per lawyer, which they can claim back in value and ultimately charge to another client or to a client on a different method. And so that's how that value added is structured. And at the bottom part, what I've just done is just talk a bit more about those realization rates. So we define the realization rate as the amount of firm invoices compared to the amount of billable work actually performed. And you can see that those industry averages are at 81%. And so what Define does is it frees up that time and allows you to improve those realization rates, which would ultimately increase the revenue per lawyer. So that's just a little bit of an analysis around, the usage of efficiency tools within law firms and how we like to think about it ourselves. So the last point, maybe before I'll open the floor to any questions or feedback, is how do we price? So we price on a per user per month basis. We don't have a minimum license requirement. So if you wanted to start with one license, that's completely fine. We also allow users to sort of try before they buy. So if you wanted to do a free trial of the software, we would be more than happy to arrange that. Pricing does vary based on jurisdiction. We really currently only work in the UK, the USA, and a bit of Europe. So we're very flexible to pricing models based, on currency fluctuations. I know that if I were just to take, what we charge a UK client and put it into South African rands, that it would probably be unaffordable. And we need to accommodate to the value that's being created for each firm in their respective jurisdiction. And that goes to the equation that I showed you a bit before. So typical pricing does vary at about £45 per user per month. But what we would be happy to do is actually use that pilot or trial period for you to see the value firsthand, and then have that discussion around that value being created and how we would price to make sure that ultimately where we charge is a win-win for everyone. So conscious I've been talking for quite a long time without sort of taking a breath or letting anyone interject. More than happy to hear any feedback, any sort of questions, anything you like or didn't like about the software. But as I said, really appreciate everyone taking some time to hear me out and see the software.
Brilliant. Thank you, Rhys. Just while people are sort of warming up their thoughts and with any questions, one question I have is, this is obviously your software, but you're a lawyer. You're not or an ex-lawyer. So this has come from, I suppose, you solving your own pain points in the past and a legal problem from a legal perspective, as opposed to from a tech perspective. Yeah. But you've lived and breathed this. So when you go through Define, obviously in the demo, you're skipping about. You're skipping about the contract very easily. What happens in terms of training and understanding and getting used to the Define software? And it looks fairly intuitive, but how intuitive is it?
Yeah, it's again, and that's why we sort of let people have that free trial, because anything I say is always going to be biased towards being salesy, but it is very intuitive. I think we've very much focused on the fact of how do we plug into existing workflows the way that lawyers are already working. They're working in Word. It's really just about the ability to double click and make simple edits. So it's very intuitive. Typically, the training sessions that we do are only 30-minute training sessions, and the training itself takes about 15 minutes. And then we have the last sort of 15-minute part to really just answer any questions. We also have training videos so people can self-serve themselves if they don't want to do a live call. We also have a number of quick reference guidance, that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, we're a young company, so we're not very prescriptive in how we do things. So we're very happy to, be very sort of client-centric in how we think about training. If someone wants to do 7 training sessions or wants to have a training session every 3 or 6 months or anything like that, that's something we'd be more than happy to accommodate.
Great. Anybody else, any questions?
Yeah,
No, that was
Roberta speak. Oh, please go on. Go on.
no. It's helpful. It's a question. I would say training the software, and you said that it works with various types of, forms of definitions, etc. If I start with a document, how easy is it to get the software to? You showed it pulling out the definitions, but I guess how smart is it? Because we all have different ways of doing it. How much training is there required, or setting of parameters so it can be effective? I think that would be the difficult part in implementation.
Yeah, and it's a great question. So, I think it's one of the things that we differentiate ourselves on. I actually know a client that's onboarding another tool, and they're having to do the whole set the parameters and the sensitivities, and takes most of the time. So Define works out of the box. So, you wouldn't have to do any kind of training on your side. You would literally download the file and it'll appear in Microsoft Word, and whatever document you have open, you just click scan document like I did in the demo, and it would just work. We're lucky that we got some pretty top tech people on our side that have managed to do a lot of those kind of things. I know, for example, a lot of US and Canadian style documents can be different structured to, English common law jurisdictions. So we cater for all of those nuances. And we've sort of done that hard work in the back end, sort of the 2 years we spent in development to make sure that it works out of the box and it works across the full sort of suite of documents that exist out there.
Many thanks for your presentation. It was very interesting, really. Just two basic questions. The first one is a technical one. Does this software work with Word for Mac, or does it need the Windows version of Word?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And at the moment we don't. So at this moment we're just on PC, but the Word version, the Mac version will be ready towards the end of this year. So around September, October, we'll have the Mac version ready. But at this moment, it's just for PC. So great question.
Okay. And second question, when the version of the software working with languages other than English is expected to be available?
Sorry, is it expected?
To be available.
So that'll be beginning of next year. So we sort of, what we did and just from, what we did when we did this English version was we spent a lot of time going through thousands of contracts and basically creating the rules behind how those work. What we're doing with new languages is we're reversing the process. So we've developed our own machine learning and natural language processing techniques, and essentially basically just ingesting foreign language contracts. And then that algorithm picks up the rules and then expands rapidly. So we would basically start being able to expand into new languages at a very rapid pace. And that's expected to go live beginning of next year. So whether you reviewing a contract in Spanish, Italian, English, Define would just work as expected.
Perfect. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thanks, Roberto.
Hi, Rhys. Hi, everyone. Well, we are a law firm from Brazil, and we speak Portuguese. I would like to know if Portuguese is in the plan.
Yeah, exactly. So, we've sort of, in terms of the feedback that we've received from languages, right now, obviously, the big ones that we will start with, Portuguese will be one, Spanish, Italian, French, and German are where we're getting the most sort of requests. We typically are used in Portuguese-speaking countries by sort of the international firms we work with. So they're quite keen to see those new languages get implemented. As I said, we can almost do languages at once simultaneously. We don't have to onboard each one individually. So we would be able to scale rapidly into all of those languages.
Okay, thank you. And you as I understood, it's not an intrusive plugin, right? And of this for Microsoft Word, but so the updates is something that we have to upload to download the new versions as you develop new features.
Yeah. So what we're doing at the moment, and so at the current moment, the new updates are manual stores. But we now also offer basically an on-prem solution. So Define would basically just sit on your own servers and updates would be pushed through there. But the same principle would apply, that no sensitive contract data would ever leave your secure infrastructure.
Perfect. Thank you. So for now, we just have in English for English documents, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. Thank you.
I think there will be quite some interest when you do go multilingual, and I mean, obviously we have Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese interested here. So I think there's probably some people who are going to be sort of waiting in the wings when you've got your language capability up and running, and also due diligence tool for PDF.
Yes, so I was actually just about to mention that. So the other thing that we're launching the next, probably in the next 2 months, is our PDF solution. So everything you saw with respect to Microsoft Word, we're going to make available in PDF. So that's not just your sort of clean PDF images, that's also any scan contract. So I remember from my lawyer days, sometimes your client sends you a scanned contract, an executed version of a contract that was signed 20 years ago, and it's all skew and hard to sort of read and review. Define will ultimately be able to read that contract, and you'll be able to interact with that agreement exactly as you saw in Microsoft Word, bar the editing features for it.
Can I just quickly ask if you have any more detail about the pricing? Just because, I mean, from my firm's perspective, I think there are some of us like me who would use it all the time. And then we have people in practice areas that probably don't need this very much, just because it's not what they do. I mean, I write contracts all day. So, and our size is such that I think, it would be useful for a certain percentage of our work, but probably not all that necessary for another portion of our work.
Yeah, 100%. And I can get some of that stuff to Keith, Chad, you can send across. But I think, as a sort of overarching principle, we're quite flexible to have that discussion and see where that value lies. And, we don't, you can take out one license or you can take out 8 or whatever it is. So we don't say you have to buy a bucket of 20 or anything like that. So, you can make sure it's only given to the people who will actually use it within the organization.
Okay. I'm to be honest with you, this is an IT thing that's probably above my level of IT knowledge, but I don't know whether it would be possible for us to deploy it to individuals or whether it would have to be implemented firm wide, because I know we've recently migrated to 365 and we've got a lot of central servers for working remotely and stuff like that. So I'm not really sure. I mean, maybe the answer already.
You typically can, and we deal with 365 and Citrix servers and stuff like that. But we're also more than happy to have a separate conversation with your IT team and just iron over any technical stuff. You don't have to worry about that. We can handle that kind of stuff in the back end.
Okay. Thank you.
Pleasure.